There are times when it appears that the human body and mind are the last true, unexplored frontiers. Even after centuries of research in the field of medicine, we still do not know everything there is to know about how the brain operates, and the human body consistently astonishes us with its depth of mystery and the medical marvels it possesses. One such case comes to us from New York in the United States, where a bedridden woman would demonstrate psychic and physical gifts that remain unexplained to this day. Throughout history, there have been cases that have served to confuse and baffle experts, leaving us to ponder on how little we actually know about our minds and bodies. Mary Jane Mollie Fancher appeared to be an entirely typical young lady. She was born on August 16, 1848, and she spent the majority of her life in Brooklyn in the city of New York. Even though she had a somewhat difficult childhood, with her mother passing away when she was only 7 years old, and her father being absent from her life for the majority of the time, she was still thought of as a smart, well-liked, and level-headed woman. She went to a reputable school and, according to all reports, was an excellent and model student. In 1864, despite her generally good health, she began experiencing gastrointestinal problems that her physicians diagnosed as nervous indigestion. In order to alleviate her symptoms, they recommended that she engage in a riding regimen to help her relax. It is not clear what connection this was going to have to the strangeness that was about to engulf her life, but this is where things are going to start getting strange. The strange case of a woman who would turn out to be an indecipherable psychic and medical mystery that has never been solved will now be discussed. On May 19, 1864, while she was out riding one day, she was thrown from her horse, which caused her to sustain some broken bones as well as a head injury. She would thankfully make a full recovery, though she would continue to suffer from episodes of fainting and severe headaches. Unfortunately for her, however, her run of bad luck with horses would not change. On June 8, 1865, Fancher's skirt became entangled in a horse-drawn trolley as she was attempting to disembark from it, and as a result, she was dragged behind it for a considerable distance. She would miraculously survive, but not without suffering some serious injuries, including issues with her vision, dizziness, and damage to both her head and her spinal column. She would start to claim that she had a strong connection to the spirit world, frequently having visions and going into trances for extended periods of time, sometimes for days, weeks, or even months at a time. The accident had also left her bedridden, and she would start to claim this after the accident. She also suffered from episodes of paralysis and blindness, both of which doctors were unable to explain. It was during these times that she would exhibit some peculiar anomalies. On February 3rd, 1866, Fancher is said to have suddenly bolted upright from her bed, let out an ear-piercing shriek, and then fell into a strange, trance-like coma. This coma would last for a full 9 years, but during that time, she would display a wide variety of strange behaviors. In his book, All Around the Town, Herbert Asbury would later write about this topic. She did not utter a single word during those 9 years, and her eyes remained closed the entire time. For 6 of those years, her body was ice cold and rigid. There was no indication that she was breathing, and her doctors could only detect a very slight pulse. On occasion, she was coerced into eating, but for periods of several months at a time, she received no nourishment other than a small amount of water. During the final 3 years of the long trance, she uttered a few words now and then, and she regained the ability to move her left arm with a good deal of freedom. In that time period, she penned 6,500 letters, a score of poems and lyric prayers, and made a satin waist and pleated lining for her coffin, amongst other accomplishments such as crocheting and making wax flowers. When she finally awoke and was lucid, she discovered that she could remember little about her life, a form of amnesia. She claimed that she could see psychically through her forehead, despite the fact that she had lost her vision in both of her eyes. She was able to teleport astrally out of her physical form, read what was written on pieces of paper that were encased within envelopes simply by placing her hands on them, read minds, and exhibit a variety of other forms of psychic power. She was able to predict future events with uncanny accuracy, including the death of her own brother. She was also able to travel astrally out of her physical form. She was also aware of the impending arrival of people and storms, and she had a tendency to terrify both her medical professionals and the people who were responsible for her care. In addition to all of this, it seemed as though she now had a number of different personalities living inside of her. These personalities, which she referred to as Idol, Sunbeam, Ruby, Pearl, and Rosebud, were each like a distant entity with her own set of memories and personality traits. Her assertions that she was no longer required to consume anything for sustenance were equally as peculiar as the rest of this information. In point of fact, it was said that she could go for months at a time without eating, and according to some accounts, she could go for years without so much as a mouthful. Consequently, she was becoming an increasingly popular topic of discussion in the media. The bedridden woman with psychic powers who did not need to eat was now being referred to as the Brooklyn Enigma, and she attracted hordes of medical professionals, psychiatrists, and people just curious about her condition. It is said that even the famous showman P.T. Barnum pleaded with her to appear in his show, despite the fact that she was already quite famous at the time. Many skeptics who moved in to debunk her claims would go away baffled, such as a well-respected astronomer by the name of Henry Parkhurst, who performed a series of experiments on her and came away convinced that she was the real deal. During this whole ordeal, she was confined to a bed, she had significant vision loss, and she struggled even to move her limbs. If you were to ask her why she thought all of this was happening, she would respond as follows: "There must be some covert reason why I'm being kept alive, and I think perhaps it is just to demonstrate to thousands of people who are suffering that the human soul is greater than the body and can triumph over any illness or pain that the body may have to go through." Fancher would spend the next 50 years of her life bedridden, never leaving her room, and mystifying all who witnessed her with her abilities and her apparent lack of requirement for any form of sustenance until the day she passed away on February 11th, 1916. What exactly was the matter with this woman? We are left to speculate because there has never been any evidence produced to suggest that she was a fraud. Was she just a hallucinating invalid who spent her days in bed and managed to fool everyone? Was this some kind of elaborate joke? Despite all of the attention that she was getting at the time, no one was ever able to prove that, and the mystery has not been solved to this day. Whatever it was that was going on with her, it is a very strange case that combines strange psychic powers with a medical mystery that has never fully been explained. Flight 2501 of Northwest Orient Airlines left New York City at 7:30 p.m. on the evening of Friday, June 23, 1950, en route to Seattle, Washington, with a stopover in Minneapolis, Minnesota scheduled. There were 55 passengers, 1 captain, 1 co-pilot, and 1 stewardess on board the aircraft. The flight was to cross the continental United States. When the plane took off, there was no reason to suspect that it would be anything other than a routine flight. In fact, for the first leg of the journey, it was a routine flight. The weather that evening was warm and pleasant, and when the plane took off, there was no reason to suspect that it would be anything other than routine. Despite this, Flight 2501 was about to become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in aviation history when it vanished with all of its passengers and crew aboard, never to be seen or heard from again. After flying over Cleveland, Ohio, and continuing west toward Minneapolis, Minnesota, the flight had been completely uneventful up until the point where the pilot, a 35-year-old man named Captain Robert C. Lind, radioed in to say that the flight was on schedule. When Lind made his second call to the air traffic control, the DC-4 aircraft that he was flying was approximately 3,500 feet above Lake Michigan. He asked for permission to descend to 2,500 feet. The request was perfectly normal and calm, with no mention of bad weather or anything amiss, even though it was known that there were storms at the time over some portions of Lake Michigan and other areas. Despite this fact that he did not give a reason for this sudden change in altitude, it was perfectly normal and calm. Because there was already other air traffic in the area, the request could not be granted. Lind merely confirmed this information before ending the call, without any further complications. Nobody aboard the flight would be heard from or seen again after this point in time. After the plane missed its scheduled arrival time at its destination, there were attempts made to make contact on all available frequencies. However, these attempts were unsuccessful. There was no further word on what happened to the plane. There were no communications, and there was no sign of the flight. By the time dawn arrived and there was still no sign of the flight, it was obvious that something very serious had happened. It was presumed that the plane had crashed, possibly as a result of a storm that had abruptly changed direction, so an enormous search and rescue operation was immediately launched. This operation involved the United States Navy, the United States Coast Guard, and the state police from Illinois, Michigan, Washington, and Indiana, who searched the area but initially found nothing. It wasn't until 13 hours later that Coast Guard vessels were able to find some rather ominous traces of the plane that had gone missing. They were able to find an oil slick as well as a variety of different kinds of debris floating around in the foggy, cold water, such as a fragment of a fuel tank float, seat cushions, clothing, blankets, luggage, cabin lining, a seat armrest, fragments of upholstery, and an airline logbook. All of these different kinds of debris were very small pieces that were reported to be no bigger than your hand. Divers, sonar, and trawlers dragged the bottom of Lake Michigan in an effort to find any other trace of the wreckage of the plane, but nothing more could be found. Furthermore, it was not possible to determine where or why the plane had gone down, and there were no further signs of any wreckage. To everyone's knowledge, the only thing that happened to the plane was that it had crashed, and because there were 58 people on board, it was the most catastrophic aviation accident in the history of the United States. During the course of the extensive search efforts that were being conducted, the authorities were attempting to reconstruct what had taken place. There were at least 2 reports of witnesses seeing an explosion in the sky, and witnesses stated that they saw a bright flash of light in the area close to where the plane had made its last radio transmission. Lieutenant Commander R.T. Helm, a retired member of the United States Navy, was one of the people who saw these strange occurrences in the sky. Helm saw a plane fly over his house near Benton Harbor and reported what he saw. Around 12:20 on Saturday morning, I awoke to the sound of an airplane flying over my house. When I looked out the window, I noticed that he appeared to be flying at a relatively low altitude. I have no idea how low it goes. During that time, there was a terrifying electrical storm that was raging. A few minutes later, as I continued to watch the lake from my vantage point, I saw an airplane flying in an easterly direction while flashing its landing signals. The lights proceeded to approach my home at an ever-increasing distance. After a few minutes, there was a tremendous flash that was visible out in the lake. Another witness, a woman, saw the plane and then a flash, and she described the event as follows. All of a sudden, there was this flash. It was a peculiar-looking light. It resembled the appearance of the sun as it was setting. It didn't even last a second before it vanished into thin air. As a result of reports such as these, the minuscule pieces of debris, it was speculated that Flight 2501 might have been involved in a devastating explosion while it was in flight, which would have resulted in its complete disintegration. On the other hand, the cause of such a massive explosion was a mystery, and there was no concrete evidence to suggest that this was the situation. There was also the theory that the aircraft had been brought down by lightning. A third theory suggested that the flight had been met with an unexpected and sudden squall, and that the pilot had attempted to fly around it. This was probably the reason that Lind had requested a change in altitude, but he did not mention this in his final radio report. The reason for this is still a mystery, and no one can say for certain what happened to Flight 2501 or where it ended up going. Although the official search was eventually called off, there have been ongoing efforts and expeditions in the decades since then to try and find the mysterious missing plane. Clive Cussler, a famous author and explorer, collaborated with the Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates, a nonprofit organization based in Michigan, to initiate a massive annual search for the missing plane. They began their search in 2004 and continued it for a total of 13 years, during which time they covered hundreds of square miles in the region that they had determined to be the most likely area when it went down. During this time, they utilized the most cutting-edge equipment that was at their disposal. However, despite the fact that they discovered 10 shipwrecks, there was not a single trace of Flight 2501, not even a single scrap of wreckage. Valerie Van Heest, co-director of the MSRA and author of a book on the incident titled Fatal Crossing, has been one of the most dogged researchers hunting for Flight 2501. She has discovered a variety of new information on the disappearance and its aftermath. Her team has made significant headway in their efforts to map the paths of debris using advanced weather prediction technology and computer simulations. This has allowed them to significantly narrow the search area for the likely location of the plane's crash. Van Heest was successful in accomplishing this goal with the assistance of Dr. David Schwab, a retired scientist who had worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and was an authority on forecasting changes in the weather above the Great Lakes. He describes his part in their investigation as follows. My research focuses on how the physics of the Great Lakes interact with the physics of the atmosphere above the Great Lakes. It was my responsibility to use the locations of the wreckage to make educated guesses as to where the plane might have crashed. We are able to simulate how a piece of debris would move and where it would go hour by hour after it had started at some location based on those currents, as well as the winds that blow over the lake because of the simulation. I obtained meteorological data from the weather stations located in Muskegon, South Bend, Chicago, and Milwaukee, and then I interpolated those winds over the lake. We have a fairly accurate estimation of the type of wind that was blowing during the time period in question when the plane crashed. It was not always the case that these currents move in the same direction as the wind. If something is floating really high in the water, the wind is going to have a greater impact on it than the current is going to have. It was around midnight when the first reports of the plane crashing came in, at which point all of the pieces of debris were scattered into the air simultaneously. We looked for the pieces of debris whose paths took them closest to the times and locations where the rescue teams reported seeing debris. We are able to construct a probability map of where the plan may have failed based on the correlation between the paths these pieces of debris took and the times and places where actual debris was found. This allows us to take the pieces of debris that came the closest to us and investigate where they originated, which provides us with an idea of where the plan may have failed. The group believes that they are in the position to finally find the solution to the mystery now that they have this information. However, the plane has still not been discovered, turning the investigation into something akin to an ongoing treasure hunt. Since the investigation has not led to a conclusion as of this moment, we are left wondering what happened to the airplane and to all of the people who were aboard it. It appears that something terrible occurred out there on that unfortunate evening, but what exactly happened or where the plane, along with its crew and passengers, went has continued to be one of aviation's greatest mysteries that has not been solved to this day. Disaster and misfortune might hit us at any time in our perilous world. It frequently seems completely out of our control because we can never predict when our time is up or when death will knock on the door. Usually it is, but on numerous times people have beaten the odds to avoid what should have been certain death without having a good explanation for how they did it. People who appear to have lived throughout anomalous and miraculous means are individuals who are hailed as actual miracles. One group of these survivors includes people who have been in fatal aviation accidents, emerging as the sole survivor in what should have been a fiery demise, provoking speculation as to why this might be. The story of Serbian flight attendant Vesna Valobi is among the most incredible examples of someone surviving an accident in midair. She was employed by JAT Flight 367, which departed Copenhagen Airport in Denmark at 3:15 p.m. on January 26, 1972, bound for Belgrade with 28 passengers and staff on board. The trip started off without incident, but somewhere above the Czechoslovakian highlands, things became terrifying. A huge explosion in the luggage compartment interrupted the up to that point smooth and uneventful flight at 4:01 p.m., and somewhere over the far-flung Czechoslovakian settlement of Sibirska Kamenets, the aircraft started to rapidly disintegrate. Fortunately, a food cart wedged itself against the DC-9's fuselage as it separated from the rest of the aircraft, keeping Valobi inside as the others fell to their deaths. Luggage and panicked passengers were pulled out and scattered into the wind. A peasant eventually discovered Volovi, who had plunged 33,000 feet towards the ground and was found bleeding and wailing uncontrollably among the mangled wreckage. She was saved by a villager named Bruno Honke, who had previously worked as a medic during World War II, and he kept her alive until they could transport her to the hospital, where it was discovered that she had suffered shattered legs and vertebrae, a fractured skull, a temporary paralysis. She would spend several months in the hospital, including a few days in a coma, but gradually recovering completely, with the only lingering consequence being a tiny limp she would have for the rest of her life. It was still considered astonishing, even though officials would later theorize that the fuselage, trees, and angle of impact had all helped to soften the fall, and that Volovi's low blood pressure had ensured that she had passed out after the cabin depressurized and prevented her heart from bursting when she smashed into the ground. She still retains the Guinness World Record for surviving the longest fall without a parachute, regardless of the causes for her survival, which was seen as a miracle. The fact that Volovi was confused for another flight attendant called Vesna when she was assigned the assignment makes the whole situation even weirder, because she wasn't even scheduled to be on that plane that day. She didn't lose her fear of flying once she got well, and despite her traumatic experience, she attempted to reapply for her previous position, but was turned down. Volovi rose to fame in Yugoslavia and was hailed as a national hero, but she avoided the spotlight throughout her life and preferred to lead a quiet existence in isolation until her passing in 2016, at the age of 66. Bahia Bakari, who was traveling with her mother on Yemenia Flight 749 from Paris, France, to the Comoros, an island nation off the coast of Mozambique, on a summer vacation to see family, is another miraculous example. Bahia was just 13 years old at the time. They had a smooth flight to their stopover in Sena, Yemen, where they boarded Yemenia Flight 626 for the final leg of their journey. However, on approach over the Indian Ocean near the north coast of Comoros, just minutes from their destination, tragedy struck when the plane abruptly plummeted into the ocean to spectacularly break apart. Of the 153 passengers on board, but Bahia was somehow evacuated from the aircraft as it crashed down, and she was flung into the water. As night fell and the waters grew choppy and the currents roared, Bahia had no life jacket and had never learned to swim, helplessly clung to the floating pieces of the plane. Before being discovered by a passenger ship that just so happened to come across her, she would bob along in the darkness overnight for 9 hours without food or water and surrounded by a jet fuel slick that frequently went in her mouth and burned her throat, nose, and stomach. Bahia received just modest medical attention for a fractured collarbone, hypothermia, burns to her knees, and bruises, while everyone else on the plane perished. She has now earned the moniker the Miraculous Girl and been recognized as the survivor of both the worst maritime accident with a single survivor and the second deadliest crash with a single survivor in history. Later, she would pen a memoir titled Moi Bahia, Le Miraculous, or I'm Bahia, the Miracle Girl, in which she detailed her experience. Apparently, Steven Spielberg expressed interest in adapting the book into a movie, but was turned down by Bahia because she believed it would be too terrible. Northwest Flight 255, with 149 passengers and 6 crew members, departed Detroit Metropolitan Airport on August 16, 1987, for the next stage of its journey to John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana, California. The flight did not travel very far before the MD-80 aircraft started to roll from side to side immediately after takeoff due to some sort of technical issue. The plane's left wing collided with a light pole in the airport rental car lot and broke off, sending the aircraft careening out of control and into a building before coming down into the Detroit suburb of Romulus. The city was in disarray after this terrible accident into a neighborhood. The emergency services shut down the airport almost away, and when they arrived at the accident site, they saw debris all over the place, and the fuselage's remains in a burning mess. The plane was a jumble of twisted metal and fragments after the crash, until utterly destroyed. There was no way anyone could have survived the collision, and when firefighters and paramedics got on the scene, it came as a bit of a surprise to them when they heard a faint moan coming from somewhere among the charred debris, as when they started working on investigating the wreckage, the Romulus Fire Department's Lieutenant John Theed would say, "I was examining 3 or 4 passengers when I noticed a chair that was turned upside down. After shifting the chair to the right and examining the woman within, I noticed that she had no vital signs and that her arm was emerging from the chair." Cecilia Sitchin, a Tempe, Arizona 4-year-old, was the owner of that arm. The bodies of her mother and father were only a few feet away, and she was still alive while facing down and still belted in her seat. She was rescued from the collision site by shocked firefighters, who then transported her to the hospital. In the end, it would be discovered that miraculously, young Cecilia was the only survivor out of the 155 persons abroad. Following her recovery, she moved in with her maternal aunt and uncle in Birmingham, Alabama, and for many years she kept the occurrence a secret.
I think about the accident every day. It's kind of hard not to think about it when I look in the mirror. I have visual scars.
Cecilia, now using her married name of Cecilia Crocker, would not speak to the public about her ordeal until 2011 at the earliest. What are we up against in situations like this? How have these folks overcome all odds and survived a terrible catastrophe that has claimed the life of everyone else but them? Is this just a coincidence, a stroke of luck, or a fluke? Or could there be more to it? A hint at a deeper universe-wide mystery, the future? As they stand, there are some really fascinating stories of individuals who have somehow overcome all odds and who inspire us to believe that maybe even in our darkest hours, all is not lost. The human brain and the capabilities it possesses are realms that we are only just starting to understand, and a significant portion of this domain is still obscure and just as mysterious as the furthest reaches of space. There are a wide variety of conditions and phenomena that are associated with the brain and the mind that we are just not able to comprehend, and the secrets of these conditions and phenomena continue to elude us despite our best efforts. One of these is a very real scenario in which people have, for reasons that we have not yet been able to understand, suddenly begun to speak with an accent from a faraway land even though they have never been there. Among these are eerie conditions that affect a person's behavior, mannerisms, or speech. The mysterious condition known as foreign accent syndrome is a medical condition in which patients suddenly and inexplicably develop a foreign accent after experiencing some kind of accident or trauma, or sometimes for reasons that are unknown. The condition is referred to as a mystery. The accent is almost always from a place the patient has never even been to before and can range from either being a vague and general accent, like a European accent, or Russian accent to being very specific to a particular region within a country, such as an American picking up a Manchester accent from England. Interestingly, the speaker might pick up an accent of a foreign language, yet not attain any fluency with that accent's native tongue. For example, a person who speaks English can pick up a French accent without actually becoming able to speak French. The person who is speaking is frequently aware that they are speaking in a distinctive manner, but they do not know why they are using this accent or where it even originates, and they are unable to consciously control it. If it all sounds pretty bizarre, that's because it is. And this has been documented for a long time without any really gaining any understanding of exactly how or why it happens. The first known instance of FAS dates back to 1907 when the French neurologist Pierre-Marie observed a Parisian man who, after suffering a stroke, began speaking with an accent similar to that of the Alsace region. Following that, additional cases would be reported over the course of the subsequent years. A neurologist by the name of George Herman Monrad Krohn examined a Norwegian woman by the name of Astrid in the year 1941. Astrid had been struck in the brain by a shrapnel while she was a victim of World War II raid. She soon after developed a German accent, which caused her a great deal of trouble. At the time, the Germans were occupying Norway, which they had been doing since 1940, and she was frequently shunned by her own people or refused service in shops because she was mistaken for a German by fellow Norwegians. This was because she was thought to be German. It did not matter how hard she tried, she was never able to rid herself of this accent, and it followed her to the grave. At the time, there was no agreed upon name for the condition, and it would not be until 1982 that the neurologist Henry Whitaker would coin the phrase foreign accent syndrome. Cases have persisted sporadically all the way up until the present day, and they can cover a wide range of potential outcomes and be rather peculiar. In some cases, there is some very obvious physical trauma or injury involved, such as an accident, head injury, tumor, or stroke. An example of a case that is typical of this form of FAS comes from the year 2005, when a woman named Leanne Rowe from Tasmania, Australia, was involved in a serious car accident. As a result of the accident, she suffered a broken back and jaw. She had slurred speech when she woke up in the Austin Hospital in Melbourne because of their injuries. However, after she healed, she was astounded to find that she now spoke with a noticeable French accent.
Because it's very peaceful. Not many people about.
This was strange for her because she had never even been to France or any country that spoke French, nor did she have any particular interest in the language or the culture of those countries. She has never been able to rid herself of the accent, and Miss Rowe claims that since the accident, she has struggled with anxiety and depression as a result. Her daughter takes the place of her in public speaking. She has expressed her frustration by saying,
It makes me so angry because I am Australian. I am not French.
It might be easy to think that the syndrome and symptoms must be caused by some sort of serious injury or trauma, but this is not always the case, with some cases having no apparent cause at all. The condition known as psychogenic foreign accent syndrome occurs when a patient suddenly begins speaking with an accent that is not native to them, even though there is no evidence of brain damage or any other physical reason why this should occur. In one such instance, in the year 2011, an American woman by the name of Karen Butler in the state of Oregon went in for routine dental surgery to have some of her wisdom teeth extracted. Afterward, when the numbing effect of the anesthetic wore off, she discovered that she now spoke with a British accent.
It's for Dr. Hooker to pull all of my upper teeth and make me a set of dentures. And he gave me a drug that would put you to not completely unconscious, because a doctor needs to be able to manipulate, tell me to move your head left, open your mouth, that kind of thing. But when you are done, you have no recollection at all. So to me, I went to sleep, and when I woke up, I had this accent.
It is extremely puzzling as to why she should have any kind of speech impediment at all, let alone a foreign accent, given that she has been identified as having FAS, but doctors have been unable to identify any brain damage or possible cause for her condition. The best explanation that they have come up with is that Butler had some kind of minor stroke while she was undergoing surgery. However, there is no physical evidence of this, and there is no reason why she would all of a sudden start speaking with a British accent. Over this period of time, the accent has never been eradicated. Another incident occurred in 2011, this time involving a woman from Kent, England named Julie Matthias, who, after suffering from a severe migraine headache that appeared to leave no lasting damage behind, developed an accent that was frequently misunderstood for being South African, French, or Italian. Julie Matthias was 49 years old at that time. In some cases, there are no physical brain problems or identifiable organic brain injury, nor even any health issue at all, but the patient displays deep mental problems that may lie at the root of it. In 2016, there was one incident of this nature, which was documented in case reports of psychiatry. It involves an African American woman who is 34 years old and has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. To say that it is an unusual case would be an understatement. After an altercation in which the patient had attacked her landlady and accused her of using voodoo magic to curse her to make her hair fall out, she was taken by ambulance to the psychiatry emergency room for an evaluation of aggression. The evaluation was performed because the patient had attacked her landlady. After this, she started speaking with a clear and recognizable British accent, but no one seems to be able to figure out why this happened. The peculiar report says the following in part. There was no symptoms suggestive of mania, seizure disorder, head trauma, loss of consciousness, cerebral vascular accident, Parkinson's disease, anxiety, or other organic brain disorder. The patient stated that they have never used nicotine, alcohol, or any other substances that produce psychoactive effects, neither currently nor in the past. 10 months earlier, the patient was admitted to an inpatient psychiatric facility for the first time due to an acute exacerbation of her paranoid schizophrenia and FAS. She was prescribed risperidone tablets, which led to an improvement in her condition, including a change in her accent when she was discharged when she was less psychotic. The patient's family history included both schizophrenia and sickle cell disease. The patient's brother suffered from sickle cell disease. Brother, mother, and uncle had schizophrenia. Both the birth and the history of the individual's development were unremarkable. The patient denied having been emotionally, physically, and there were no reports of learning disabilities or behavioral issues pertaining to the patient. She had completed some college and had been employed as a nurse's aide up until approximately 5 months before presenting herself to the hospital. An examination of the patient's mental status revealed a middle-aged woman with dark hair who had poor eye contact but did not appear to be in any apparent distress. The patient was tangential and preoccupied with voodoo and was deeply paranoid of her neighbors and her mother's landlady. Auditory hallucinations were not elicited, and she denied suicidal ideation at the time of evaluation. The patient maintained that she had the intent to murder the landlady who took care of her mother. She was awake, alert, oriented in time, place, and person, attentive, and had good concentration, but she lacked impulse control and couldn't control her impulses. Both her perception and her judgment were clouded. Memory for the immediate past, the short term, and the long term were all undamaged. There were no noteworthy pathological findings discovered during the patient's physical examination. The investigations in the laboratory turned up nothing remarkable. The ECG revealed that there was no evidence of a seizure. The structural MRI as well as the MR angiography of the head both came back negative for any abnormalities. The patient was evaluated by a speech therapist because they appeared to have an accent that was similar to that of the British, despite the fact that they had never lived in Britain. There were no issues with the phonetics or the grammar, but there was a problem with the prosody, which included the prominence of the pitch of the words and the syllables. The patient's pitch range was limited as a result of the fact that she only rarely showed any emotions while she was speaking. Her voice was monotonous, and she stumbled over her words while speaking at a low volume. She used TH in place of F and W in place of WH, in addition to T in place of D and AI in place of EI. The patient exhibited no improvement in her psychotic symptoms, and there was no change in the foreign accent she spoke with. Due to her paranoia, she refused to take any additional antipsychotic medication when it was offered. Throughout the course of treatment, the patient retained her British accent and continued to express thoughts of committing murder, as well as paranoid thoughts directed toward the woman who was her mother's landlady. Due to the fact that her psychotic symptoms never subsided, she was admitted to a psychiatric facility that specializes in long-term care. The fact that there is such a wide range of cases of FAS only serves to heighten the condition's air of intrigue, which is compounded by the fact that no one really understands the mechanisms that cause it or the reasons why it should manifest as a foreign accent. Researchers from diverse fields such as speech-language pathologists, neurolinguists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, and psychologists are unable to come to a consensus regarding what is occurring here or even how to diagnose it. And there are a great deal of questions for which the answers are completely unknown. Is the brain damage the cause? And if so, why does the same thing happen with people who have sustained damage to completely different parts of the brain? And why does FAS affect even people who have no discernible damage at all? Why, if it is brain damage, should it only cause a change to the individual's accent? Is it simply a problem with their speech? The symptoms of FAS are very similar to those of a condition known as apraxia of speech, which is a motor speech disorder. However, the question remains as to why the symptoms of FAS in these cases take the form of an accent change rather than a more serious speech disability. There is no unambiguous response to any of these inquiries, and considering that there were only 62 documented cases between the years 1941 and 2009, it is highly improbable that we will comprehend everything associated with it near in the future. In the meantime, there is no real treatment for those who are afflicted, and as a result, they are forced to communicate using a voice that is not really their own, and they frequently have to deal with the loss of their identity as well as the negative treatment of those who are in their immediate environment. What is going on with these people, and why is it affecting them in this very specific way, making them speak like a foreigner in the land that they call home? It's possible that one day we will have a better understanding of foreign accent syndrome, but for the time being, it will continue to be one of the many puzzling mysteries surrounding the human mind.